Okay, so good morning to everybody. Thank you for coming here for this discussion. What we're going to talk about here for a bit more than 1 hour is the importance of global education in today's world. Maybe we'll open the topics of what competencies are necessary for the future and in the times of crises in the context of education, in the context of preparing children and young people for the world they're going to live and work in. My name is Zuzana Labashova. I'm the executive director of a non-governmental organization focusing on education. And I have 4 speakers here. It's an honor to be talking to those 4 experts in this panel. So I would like to introduce Paola Berbeglia. Is that correct?
Yeah,
okay.
Correct.
And she's the president of Concord, Italy, so welcome. Then I would like to introduce Karen Pashby, the professor of global citizenship education and lead for research in the School of Education at Manchester Metropolitan University. Welcome. Next we have, and I'm sorry, I might not be reading this correctly, but Mari Vistnes-Henkter, yeah, more or less. And she's part of the Central Board of Changemaker, which is a Norwegian political and youth organization. Welcome in Slovakia. And last but not least, Günther Schall, who is the head of the Development Communications Unit in Austrian Development Agency. So thank you very much all for coming here and talking to us about those important topics. And of course, you also will have the opportunity to ask questions, to leave your comments at the very end. So I will be very happy to have questions from you as well. But I will start with one recent representative survey that happened in Slovakia just in August 2024. And we asked the general public a question that we asked them also in 2019. And we asked them a question whether they think the schools, our schools, prepare children and young people for the world beyond 2030. In 2019, a majority of the general public, more than 56%, said they think schools prepare children well. And then this year, just a few months ago, we asked the very same question, and the opinion changed radically. Today, only 22% of the general public think that the schools prepare students and pupils well for the world beyond 2030, and more than 56% think that schools are not good at preparing young people for the world that is coming. And so I would like to start with this information, this fact, and maybe it's something only happening in Slovakia, but I would suspect it's a global thing, it's a general thing that happens in different countries of the world. Paola, the first question would go to you. You are closely connected to the field of education and you support for children and adolescents. Do you think the education system gives them sufficient preparation for the world they'll be facing?
$1 million question, obviously. Thank you for the invitation, first of all. And, okay, I try to answer, having in mind that probably to cope with a good education, we have to have in mind which are the mega trends in this moment that you mentioned in your paper, for example. No? So I think that probably migration, climate change, conflicts, pandemics, and I will add also some nationalism that tend to exclude some other people is something that should be taken deep consideration. And in this case, UNESCO in 2015 gave us a sort of frame to answer. I mean, UNESCO said, you should be equipped with cognitive, socio-emotional, and behavioral competencies. I try to follow this kind of scheme in answering shortly. From the cognitive point of view, I am a cognitive anthropologist. So what I try to do with children, but also with adults, is to empower their way of thinking and of learning. And experimentally, obviously, but trying to discover something, not having answers for everything, firstly. So following the path, the mental path, and also the emotional path to reach some answers. And this is also a clear reference that we can do, for example, to the neuroscience in this moment. Mirroring. Emotional learning and putting the other's shoes is a way of learning. You know that potentially 70,000, the stimulus for learning is absolutely quicker than if you are not passionate, if you are not emotional. So this is something very, very concrete. And there are a lot of studies in this sense. For example, the polyvagal theory, that is absolutely studying this kind of connection between learning or feeling and what effect we are able to learn. So I think that in this case, prepare young people is prepare them to be absolutely able to cope with some kind of things, not giving them already all the answers, because it's impossible. The contexts are so different, and the challenges too. So I don't want to take too much time, but...
Karen has her microphone there.
Oh, I can see you.
And Karen, you are a former secondary teacher, and currently you're a professor at the School of Education. So you are also engaged in preparation of future teachers. Is that correct? Kind of.
I have,
okay.
I have been.
Do they have all the necessary information and training to be able to give our children what Paula said are the cognitive skills, but also the emotional support that needs to be done?
Well, I might take a slightly different take, because I think you've done a nice job of explaining those two aspects. I happen to also I live in the UK, but I'm Canadian, and I'm the current president of the Comparative and International Education Society of Canada. So my comparativist friends would say, be careful of making generalizations. However, I think that's particularly the case when it comes to teacher training. Mm-hmm. It's so different in each context. Myself, I had my teacher education in Quebec. Then I taught in Ontario, where I also taught teacher education. I did my PhD about Alberta. These are three completely different education systems within one country with different teacher education programs. I did a postdoc and worked in a faculty of education in Finland, and now I live in the UK. So I'm going to make brief statements, but there's a lot of context behind these things. I think one answer is absolutely not, because of a few reasons. And yes, in some ways, because of a few other reasons. I think we have to start by understanding how complex the responsibility of being a teacher is. You've just explained some of the complexity. I mean, from each disciplinary area that influences education, we could break it down even more. The teacher is responsible for this dynamic position between society and individuals. And I don't think we should ever underestimate both how difficult that is, but also the transformative possibilities therein. So having said that, I think we have to think about teacher education from kind of three main positions. One is we actually, like that survey you quote, I think it's about schools. I also think it's about society. Mm-hmm. If we in society had a better approach to these things, I think we'd feel more confident that our schools do. And so I think we as civil society members, we are also responsible for supporting teachers in their jobs. I think we really underestimate that, and we have, and this is something I do see across contexts, teachers are lacking, my next point, in institutional and material support for their jobs. So they are facing the crises we have in our society every day in their schools and their classrooms with less infrastructure, with less support, and often taking on jobs. Like in Ontario, I can remember when I was a kid, there was a nurse, there were social workers. You knew the person who cleaned the school. In our case, it was a man, but it may not be. And we knew him, we had a relationship. Now these are all contracted out, there's different people. So a lot lands on the teacher. And in global education, that is really important because for me, global education is about taking seriously the connections and interdependencies of our local and global issues. And as a result, I've often been quoted as saying we can't put the cart before the horse. So our attempts to support teachers to be good global educators are only as good as our society and our teachers' capacity to teach for anti-oppressive and anti-racism in their own schools and their own classrooms. When I was in Finland, I used to say, don't put the cart before the reindeer or something, but I'm sure there's a Slovak answer for that too. And so then my last point is I think this is where there's real possibility in teacher education, but also in continuing professional development around conceptual support. You've spoken about some of that, but I can talk a little bit about this more later, but I've been involved in participatory research with teachers where we're deepening our conceptual capacity around these issues so that we can understand the complexities and really importantly, when we as a society don't always know what to do, how does the teacher take that up in their position? It's complex, but I think there's multiple levels of responsibilities that we could be upping to support the teachers.
Thank you very much. I asked this question because we made a research in Slovakia and we went to universities preparing future teachers for their work, and we asked them whether global education and education towards sustainability is part of their curriculum in any way. How? Because we know we cannot blame teachers for not preparing the children if they themselves are not prepared well. And the answer was in Slovakia that it's not systemically part of the curriculum, but those professors at the universities who are passionate about those topics bring them into the education, but there are most who are not passionate about those topics. So I was just like looking for inspirations about how this might be done in other countries.
Well, I think in Ontario, so back to my not putting the cart before the horse, we, in Toronto specifically, there was some data collected that really evidenced the fact that Black students in particular were not, there was an awarding gap, you could say, around what they were, how teachers were assessing them, let's put it like that. There's the report you're welcome to read. And now there's this huge effort there to kind of take this up explicitly. And when you teach in teacher education, as I did, and it's not perfect, we have a lot of work to do, but every time that the teacher candidates would submit something, they had to take up equity and diversity. And in our case, because we were in a special cohort for GCE and ESD, also that. So you're right, it was kind of stuck on. But I can tell you in the UK, teacher education has been really reduced to tick box exercise of observable competencies. Now, there are some incredible teacher educators that I work with doing great work, but to me, that is not the route. So it's how we find the good relationships between what's going on in research, these expert teachers that can support our future generations and working together. But the more we reduce it into kind of tick boxing, probably not going to help.
Yeah, thank you very much. Marie, you are part of a youth organization and you directly address issues like injustice and poverty. From what I read, you actually have workshops for children and young people. Are young people in Norway interested in those issues? That's my first question. And how well are they informed about those things?
I would say maybe yes and no. Our organization works with a lot of different issues, both concerning climate change, peace work, global health as well. And we see now that there is an increased interest in these topics, especially among students, which is a very good thing. Rather, we see that there is not enough knowledge out there. So we often meet, when we talk to all these students on stands and so on, they be often, oh, I didn't know this, what is this about? So we have a lot of information campaigns to actually get this knowledge out to the rest of the public, because there is a greater need for that.
Do you cooperate also with teachers in schools?
We have a lot of panel discussions where we have schools and we have professors that are included to go deeper into different issues as well. So we are now going to have a panel discussion about traumas after war, where we have included a lot of professors that are that have more knowledge about this. And then we open up for every student and other student organization to actually come and learn more about this. And it actually works.
Wonderful. Thank you for your great work. Günther, the question to you is, what has to be done so that education fosters understanding within one society, between people? Because education is not only giving children facts and data and information, but it should also foster unity maybe in society. What has to be done so that we can prevent, or so that we can create societies and cultures without nationalist tendencies, without xenophobia, and the great polarization that we see in many countries of Europe now?
Yeah, thank you for this important question. Before I answer this, I would like to explain why Austrian Development Agency is engaging in global education. So we are the operational unit of Austrian Development Corporation, and we have a budget, or we are currently supporting more than 500 projects internationally, with a total budget of more than 800 million euros. And as you know, here in Slovakia very well, these budgets are part of political and democratic decisions. And these democratic decisions can change. And that's why we think it's quite important that the broad community of Austrian citizens is aware of the global challenges on the one hand, understands the global geopolitics, and also understands how solutions could look like, and engages in this respect. And that's why we are supporting global education with a budget of 5 million euros annually. And that's only a bit, but it can make a difference. But of course, we see the fact that formal education cannot fill the gaps. We need partners in the civil society, and we need to broaden this partnership and the collaboration of civil society partnerships. So that's why we are asking our traditional CSO partners to engage more and more with non-typical partners. For example, we did a project with the brass music youth and the Mountaineer Foundation, just to bring more young people on board for the work on the SDGs, and to link different bubbles and not to be within one group only. But don't forget, for example, the other sectors, other partners like the private sector. Our economy relies on exports most of our GDP in Austria is earned by exports. But could you imagine a racist or nationalist salesman? He will not be very successful in foreign markets. So the private sector needs open-minded people as well. So they are a supporter, and we need to strengthen these alliances. But let me give you also a very specific example what we do against racism. We did, together with the civil society organization, a project that was reviewing school books. And of course, Austrian school books are not racist because they don't have an interest. But nonetheless, there are racist formulations and specifically pictures which are transporting some expectations which do not fit in that what we think it's useful. And this analysis was quite helpful for the movement that wants to learn and improve the school books, because they haven't seen this with an outsider's perspective. So these simple measures can help us to work against racism and nationalism as well.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for the comment that it's not only about schools and teachers. The responsibility lies in the society as a whole, and we need to really burst the bubbles and connect the society again, because it's very fragmented and polarized. Part of the representative survey that we made also pointed out what are the general public actually asked schools to change several things. One was changing the curriculum and adapting it to the expectations of the modern world. But what actually came out and was, for me, very encouraging, that the general public actually wants schools to develop skills more than just building knowledge. And the skills are mostly soft skills like cooperation, communication skills, critical thinking. And this is also the direction of global education as it is. And so my next round of questions would be that we have been facing many crises in the past few years. And we had the pandemic, we have the ongoing war in Ukraine and Israel, we have political instability, we have far-right politicians becoming more powerful and strong, we have the hybrid war, we have mental health problems in young people that are really on the rise, and of course we have the climate change. So what does our society and our world need right now? And how can global education help? Paula.
You mentioned a lot of challenges, obviously. And I don't think, again, that there's just one answer for everything. It's impossible. We have to develop the capacity of thinking, rethinking, discover, etc. I take an example. When we started to talk about global citizenship education in Saudi Arabia, you can imagine which kind of challenge. It was 2020. I was there. My friend was a teacher. And there, for example, the ministry was completely established in another way. There was the prince that was the chief of the ministry. And after, all the directors were directly nominated by him. And as educators, for example, following what happened in our societies, no? He asked, but if you have something you don't agree, for example, or if there is a trouble, what do you do? And she said, no, what was decided by the chief is what we have to follow. And they were able to discover the sense of global citizenship education, exactly talking about enterprises, global competencies to overcome barriers, frontiers, etc., etc. So they took the side, if you want, of going everywhere, having the capacity to go everywhere in this sense. So if I judge this kind of idea, probably I'm not able to agree with someone other. But if I try to stress, to underline something that could be in common and not exclude the others, probably I have a base to build on. And this is exactly what I mean. It's not a receipt I have to give to the other. The sense of community, and again, talking about what happened in our brain, we have the same reception for physical pain and emotional pain. This is very interesting. It means that we have to cope with something that don't exclude the others, because excluding others is something that give bad effect not only on the excluded, but also on the people who is excluding. And this is something we have to keep in consideration. After I will talk about a good experience, but in structural way we had at national level. But these are the values I would like to stress, because I think that, for example, rethinking about articles 126 and 27 of the Maastricht Treaty is a way, a concrete way of rethinking and coping exactly with what you said. Not national identities only, because it's important to have an identity, but teaching what European, as a Europeans, we think it's important, and to focus on this.
Thank you very much. I really like what you said, and Vanessa Andreotti, the professor of global education, she has this metaphor that when we hurt others, the pain that we cause them also comes back to us. And so, Karen, what could be, how can global education become the medicine for healing the wounds?
Well, I think Vanessa would also say that her way of conceptualizing what's happening in these really interconnected crises is that we're in a process of hospicing a mode of living and a way of structuring society that is dysfunctional in some sense. And I like that metaphor because we hear a lot about climate anxiety, and we hear a lot about, you know, if we talk about how bad everything, we're just going to get apathetic. But hospicing for anyone who's had somebody that they love and die in a way that you are there for them, because not everyone gets that privilege. I think that's a nice way of thinking about it, because we love a lot of the things that need to change. And so I think for me, it's someone who does focus on formal education, but as I stated, and as I was glad to hear, thinks that formal education is only going to be as good as the opportunities in non-formal and civil society. One thing I think we need to do is kind of reclaim some of the education space, and I'm glad to hear that there's some will for that in Slovakia, for deep reflexivity. I think we went through a phase, I think we were encouraged by the Millennium Development Goals and Make Poverty History to really focus on encouraging our young people to take action. We just had a conversation, and you can follow up about this. And I think that was a really important movement away from just learning about things, actually doing things. But we still haven't addressed a really deep issue within global education, which we've known about for some time, particularly in quote-unquote global north contexts where I've been working, which is often our good intentions can reproduce the inequalities that we seek to solve. And so that's why, based on some of the work of Vanessa and others, really taking up a reflexive approach in classrooms can be really useful. And it's starting from a point of non-innocence and implicatedness, so that we are all both part of the problems and part of the solutions, albeit differently. Direct quote from Vanessa there. And I think that can support, doesn't stop actions, of course, but it's about taking reflexive action and seeing it as an ongoing process and anticipating some of the unintended consequences of our good actions. And I guess a hopeful thing for me in the middle of all this really difficult work that we're doing is that sometimes when things seem politically impossible, I think there are pedagogical possibilities. And that's the beauty of education and transformative education, is that we can think about how to relate to knowledge, to others, to humans, to more than humans. We can take that up pedagogically, and I think there's some amazing teachers out there doing that, and we should be continuing in that line.
I'll take.
Oh, sorry. I keep forgetting.
Mary? The same question goes to you. So, how can global education help in the middle of the crises that we're present today?
So I can tell about how we are working, because as mentioned before, we as a youth organization are working on getting the information out there. Because I think one of the issues is that often science and politics are often science and politics, and then you have the society. And we often miss the link between the two of them. And that's where we work, where we try to translate all this budgets and the politics and the hardcore science into more understandable and comprehensible. Because I feel like a lot of these issues are very big and it's very overwhelming, especially for youth. And living in a rather small countries, we're like, oh, but that's not our issues. There's nothing to do with, nothing we can do about it. I think what we think is important to work with is to make these big questions, big issues smaller, easier to understand, and then work on them on a local level. And then spread the information so more people know about them, get more people to be engaged, and then go directly up in the systems and go from like grassroots and up. And we see that it actually works to get the information out there, and how actually knowledge is a very big and very important part of the action that we do. And without that knowledge, we can't really do anything. So yeah, I think that's more like how we actually use the knowledge, like more how we can actually go further. Yeah, if you understood what I meant.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Günther, you have a different point of view on this probably because you're working from a different perspective. Could you give us your opinion? And I understand that your view is maybe more on the general public and not only on education, but continuing education for large masses of people. So where would you find the role of global education?
Yeah, maybe let me start with a very personal perspective. When I grew up, it was the time when the Iron Curtain came down, and at least some historians thought that it's the end of history. Now it's 35 years later, and we are in the middle of many different and severe crises. And we learned that this was not the end of history. But what we need to know about all these crises and what they have all in common is that they are all man-made. And I think I don't need to gender this because it's mainly men who are responsible for it. But this also gives us the perspective that we can change it, because it's something human, and also history is something what is not just happening to human beings. We are contributing to history, and we can shape history in the way we want it to be. But this needs a mankind that is focusing on the core values of our societies, and we need to work together. We need collaboration, cooperation. And I think that's where global education comes in. It engages young people, but it engages also other people. It gives them tools how to shape their direct ecosystem. And we all need to be more pragmatic, more hands-on in this regard. It starts with normal citizens, but it also goes up to politicians who take the decisions. All together, we can act and we can contribute to solutions.
Thank you very much. Whenever global education comes up, I kind of feel depressed because those topics are huge and they're heavy and they're many times depressing. And just like Marie said, we many times feel we have no control over it. We can do nothing about it. And every time this happens to me, I always think of the tale of the hummingbird and the burning rainforest. You might know it. If you don't, just Google it up after this discussion. I think we'll all need it. But to finish off, and whenever I do workshops of global education, I like to finish off with a little spark of hope. And so I would like all four of you to bring little sparks of hope here for the end of the discussion. And I would like to ask you to bring some examples of good practice, something that we'll be making many mistakes on and over, but maybe something that gives you hope that we can together as a society, as humankind, bring change in those difficult times.
I will give an example at structural level, as I said. I mean, in Italy, for example, we started to build on the national strategy on global citizenship education more or less in 2020. We arrived on it in 2021, and it was a common process with the national agency we had inside and also universities, CSOs as we are, and also the Ministry of Environment, Youth Agency, and so on. So starting from this, we have a sort of frame. You cannot simply cancel the frame. After, we claimed for an action plan, obviously. And this action plan led to have 2 years ago 20 million for global citizenship education in our country. So we pushed a lot and we had good results in this sense. The action plan is structured now, and there are inside a lot of actors, non-traditional actors, I mean. There are, for example, enterprises, the media world, I mean social media and others. And so not only the formal sector in education, but also absolutely a wide environment. And now we insisted, and we are working on evaluation method, because it's impossible to evaluate as, I don't know, UNESCO did in the past, just in the formal environment, this kind of effects. And so we are again working together, all these actors, on, for example, how to measure the engagement of young people. So see, for example, how many initiatives they take after the conclusion of a project. In which kind? Do they do lobby? Do they insist for what they are wishing? And this should be measured, because it's not just a question of tick or quantitative data. And it's an ongoing process. We had 4 point of view. One is exactly on sustainability from the Ministry of Environment. Another one is from us, and we insisted a lot on CSOs and global, local, absolutely. And others are insisting more on formal processes, but already established. So in this sense, it's easy. And in my opinion, this is a good practice because it's not just built by CSOs. It's a common work that is very important in this sense because it's a point of reference for all the people around.
So it's also about breaking those bubbles, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Karen, some good news from the UK.
Well, not all from the UK, but I do live in the UK and I do some work there. I mentioned earlier that many of us, not just me, but there's been lots of us trying to respond to this critique that global education, particularly in contexts in global North context, like we're in mostly here in Europe and in Canada as well, that there's this potential that we create this us who gets to be the global citizens by learning about them, and you mentioned the textbooks, and we know that there's this issue around reproducing colonial systems of power. So the possibilities I've been working on, and I'm so glad to hear examples of the infrastructure I was speaking about before and young people, but for me, I've been really looking at the pedagogical possibilities. As I mentioned, I think sometimes there's a space for opportunity pedagogically when we feel stuck politically, although those two things are related. So I've had two projects I've been working on that I think are hopeful in that sense. The first was I worked with teachers in England, secondary school teachers in England, Finland, and Sweden, and we used a tool from Vanessa Andreotti called the Heads Up framework, which identifies 7 patterns of oppression that tend to be reproduced in global learning. And we workshopped it with teachers who were interested in complexifying their teaching of global issues. And long story short, we came up with this teacher resource. And I'm a bit hesitant to use the word best practice because I think it's always context specific and who picks up the resource, etc. However, I have some evidence that this is responding to a need. Since we originally produced it in English, Finnish, and Swedish for the project, we've had people request translations and some people volunteer to translate, and it's now in French, Estonian, Czech, German, Deutsch, Portuguese, Spanish, Slovak, anyone? And so I think this...
You like Italian?
Yes, we have Italian. We have Italian. Did I not mention Italian? We have Italian. Julia, if you're out there, who worked on it. Yeah, so we have it in 9 languages. So I think this speaks to something in Europe where people are interested in taking this up. And so that's something we were just discussing. I'd like to pursue a project to follow up about that. And then we're extending this project with a group of 15 expert teachers, upper secondary school teachers in Sweden right now. And it's more concentrated on connecting critical global citizenship education and climate crisis education, and looking at to what extent concepts related to decolonial theory and reflexive praxis can support the teaching of climate crisis education and what Malcolm Ferdinand calls the double crisis of coloniality and the environment. And that's going really well. Of course, there's always challenges, but we have a final workshop with them in January to produce some resourcing as well. So I think, again, there's some really amazing teachers out there. I think we are also doing the work, hopefully, in research and theory to conceptualize these things in ways that can then support teachers in their praxis.
Thank you very much, Karen. Very helpful. Marie?
We see that there is an increased engagement within youths, especially in Norway, which we think is very amazing. There is more collaborations between different youth organizations, especially in Oslo, and where everyone is contributing together. And we also have we are very lucky that we have a great space where we can actually talk to the politicians face to face and meet them, and they are interested in talking to us as well. So we really feel seen, and I think that is important to also acknowledge. And I also think we need to also focus on the positive things, because I feel with all of the negativity that is happening in the world, we often forget that there's also a lot of great things that is happening. But the thing with crisis is that it's happening very fast, and it's happening now, but development is more of a slow trend and happening over longer years, and it's more difficult to actually see the changes as fast. So I think it's also very important to also notice that. So one fact is that I think female researchers have increased from 28 to 41% in the world since the last 20 years, which is very great. And both because often female researchers, as we know, have a more focus on other issues and taking minorities into their research. So I just also want to have, like, we also need to look at the positive things.
Thank you for reminding us. Günther?
Yeah, thanks. I would like to mention two things. On the one hand, I think you just need to work with young people and see how motivated they are to tackle their future. And one project comes into my mind where one of our partners engaged young people from several schools in Vienna, schools that were seen as very problematic with a huge migrant background, and schools who are quoted in public debates very often. But these young people, once they are in an environment where they are engaged, when they have the right tools available, they completely change, and they're getting active and develop visionary projects. And it was even for their teachers interesting to see how the methods and tools of our partners matter to engage these young people. So that's one of the positive stories, and the other positive stories is more a top-down story. It's about the Dublin Declaration, which was elaborated 2 years ago by the GENE network on a European level, and this declaration really gives a new momentum for global education, as it gives a long-term vision, as it aligns global education with the SDGs, it's advocating for policy changes, and it's emphasizing the importance of monitoring and evaluation. So this is really helping us to also build alliances and collaborations for global education.
Thank you very much, and it goes back in the circle to Paula and talking about the frame, that we need the frames. Okay, you probably have many questions buzzing in your head, so right now I would like to leave the space for your questions, and you have a unique opportunity to talk to all those experts we have here. So please, if you have questions, just raise your hand and I will run around with the microphone and hand it to you. Okay?
Just while you're running around, I'll just pick up on the Dublin Declaration, because I think it's inspiring the type of work we're doing with teachers as well, because there's an emphasis on critical reflexivity. They had the Critical Friends join in on the Dublin Declaration, so thanks for pointing at it.
Good morning. Thanks for the very interesting exchange. My name is Maria Grönewald. I'm the director of VOICE. VOICE is the largest network of humanitarian organizations in Europe. We have 90 members. And I was wondering whether you also work on the topic of education in emergencies. I checked the latest numbers, so some 400 million children, about 1 of every 5, are living in or fleeing from conflict zones. And many of our members are, of course, also engaged in education in emergencies. So I was also wondering whether you have an opinion on that specific topic. Thank you.
just say something? I was asked from some Lebanon politics to answer exactly about the crisis from Syrian people, children coming from there, and restructuring a bit their national system. The welcoming of this kind of children is not at all easy, but it's possible. It's necessary to keep in consideration, firstly. There are a lot of methods already a bit planned to support the process of learning also if you are not in your country. I mean, comparing some learning curricula, having some matters in other languages than it was given at the beginning. I mean, it's very important. It's very important also to cope with this in discussing when you have this kind of people in your classroom. And what we for example, I followed the method, the Feuerstein method. It's also suggested for this kind of people because it's not something that has to cope with an everyday work, but it's material that you can give and reflect on also on distance, also having in mind not necessarily some issues that you have to cope with. So there are pedagogical tools and means to continue this process. And it's a process of freedom, absolutely needed, absolutely.
Thank you. Anybody else would like to comment on that? Okay, if not, then we have space for more questions. Anybody?
Good morning. My name is Celia Cranfield. I work for Concord Europe, which is a network of European NGOs working on sustainable development and international cooperation. I was very struck by one of your comments that we can't imagine that global education applies just to kind of European or global North actors, and that we need to revisit our concept of it to embrace what global education might mean to everybody on this planet. So I was curious to hear what initiatives there might be that actually connect global education beyond, you know, you were speaking about Canada, we were speaking about the gene, but bringing into, and you spoke a bit about, was it Saudi Arabia, I think, but bringing countries that have maybe a very different vision of the world to ours together to work on this concept. Are there any initiatives? I'm really curious. Thank you.
I would just point to a few things. One is actually related to Jean, but it's the ANGEL network, the academic network for global education and learning. And I know Massimiliano Terenzi's led quite amount of research, at least looking at the research and around global learning, where it's coming from, what. And a big initiative that I think he led on and has been struck up quite successfully is oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the name, but I think it's called the Global Learning Review, is it? And they do a yearly take-up of all of the publications about global learning, and they have people in, this is still mostly in Europe, but I think it's starting to expand now, but in different languages. So at least we're getting more aware of who's writing about this around the world in different languages and kind of pushing against some of the lingua franca-ness. And I think also you can look at initiatives like Bridge 47, which was largely taking place in Europe, but I think there were a lot of initiatives within that to kind of branch out and include speakers and have workshops with people from around the world. So I see pockets happening, UNESCO having forums. I think CSOs are probably leading a lot on that in ways that we don't always see through the work that they do, quote unquote, on the ground. And I think that there's also, from an academic perspective, attending some of the conferences about comparative and international education is interesting because you see different international organizations presenting on the work they're doing around the world alongside really critical academic conversations around the nature of knowledge and whatnot. So I can't name one specific, and I'm sure there's others that I haven't named. I don't know that that's answering your question. I'm just trying to point to a few spaces where I see some potential.
And maybe I would, yes.
May I add something? Yeah. Because, oh, sorry. APCEU, I don't know how to pronounce it, is the clearinghouse for global citizenship education, is in Korea. So it's also an axe that is absolutely changing. It's not European, not Western countries based, but absolutely Eastern. So it's very important. And they promoted just last November, for example, the revision of recommendation 1974. It was at the base of global citizenship education, and now the accent is on peace, for example, in this very last moment. So again, absolutely yes, and a lot of things are doing globally in this sense.
And I would maybe mention, we have talked about Vanessa Andreotti a lot here. So she made this teacher tool called Through Other Eyes, where she looks at education from different perspectives from other cultures. And it's a beautiful little work of different perspectives and different metaphors of how we can perceive education. And I'm sure we have space for one last question. So anybody would like to ask one more question before we go for the coffee break? Okay.
It will be rather actually, hello, Edita, independent evaluator. And it will be rather a general, final question. As much as you know global education in Slovakia, or let's say Central Europe, what would you recommend to the different actors who are in global education? Let's say the government level, NGO level, and schools.
Thank you. I think the most relevant thing is sit together, talk together, and let the topic be there, because we also see it in Austria that global education is dealt with in different boxes and pockets, and is not aligned within the government and within the administration. So linking up the different actors, which are mostly like-minded, and creating cooperation is very helpful.
Like for youth perspective, maybe have an open space, so also the younger generation actually gets to have a seat at the table and talk to the important people as well, because there are a lot of people that want to engage but don't know, they don't get the space to actually do so.
I might just say that global citizenship education, I sometimes call myself a proponent and a critic, and I don't see it as an oxymoron. I think it's a deeply contested concept, but it's also deeply aspirational. And it's that dynamic at the heart of it that all actors need to embrace, and we can take a reflexive approach while we work together. I think what we want to make sure we're doing is that we're taking reflexive actions across these sectors and holding each other to account in a supportive way, so that what we don't do is what we have sometimes inherited. We've inherited some ways of relating that have gotten us into the problems we're in. So we want to be trying to take multiple approaches, but hopefully not multiple approaches that reproduce the same thing. So that's what I really appreciate about the multi-sector spaces like this, where we can hold ourselves to account both on upholding the possibilities and taking up the contestations together, so we can continue towards this aspirational idea that we could be global citizens and that we could have the same rights and responsibilities to all humans, you might add non-humans in there, as we do within our nation states.
I agree on what you said. Just a few words on the fact that we should create networks, alliances. This should be one of the main dimensions we should pay attention to, because otherwise each kind of point of view is too strict, if you want. No? In my opinion, building the sense of community is exactly having all the actors around and building connection among them. This is something special, of special importance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So in the past hour of talking, we've heard a lot about crises, about emergency, about feeling helpless in the situation, but we've also heard a lot about cooperation, about openness, about bursting the bubbles, and about bringing hope. So hopefully what you're leaving with today from this discussion is being energized and feeling the need to do something, because we're on the verge of something new happening. And so I maybe would encourage you to spend a coffee break, maybe just finishing, asking some questions to our guests and making the most of them being here. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the event.